Good evening and welcome. Aseem and Ashish Kodari's Churning the Earth lays bare the cost of India's development to its land and its people. At Penguin, we're very proud to be the publishers of this book. It's a book that everyone must read. I hope this evening will be the first of the many conversations that this book inspires. Now the authors will talk a little bit about the book and then the discussion begins.
Good evening and welcome and thank you. I want to say thanks to all our friends and family who are here. The list is too long to take names, but they know who they are. Without them, we would be sitting here. I want to also thank Penguin Books in particular for a very smooth publication effort, even if it took time. I think, I hope the end product is redeeming all the pain and effort it took over several years actually. I also want to thank my co-author, and we have very different styles of doing things, but we have a amazingly amicable partnership, and I think I couldn't have found a better co-author to do this with me. I want to say why I wrote my part of the book, why I thought of the book, why we have done it, and I also want to say something about why now, 2012, India 2012. And in order to give you a sort of fuller sense of the sort of background for the book, I want to take you back to 1996. 1996 is the year when I finished my PhD in economics, and I was in America at that time. And I had decided about 4 years before finishing my PhD that I was not going to spend my future in the economics profession. And those among the audience who are economists will, I think, sympathize with that sentiment. There was in me at that time a sort of vicious rebel, not just against economics but against all sorts of things. And economics I came to recognize as the sort of theology of our time. The high priesthood of our time sort of lives in the economics profession and keeps splitting hairs while the world dies and while all the nature around us is plundered and the earth is put up for sale. So I sort of began to realize that I was sort of working with the enemy all along, and I needed to get out and do something about this quickly. So I wrote a short paper at that time, which was more like a rant. It was written in a lot of anger about why I'm quitting the economics profession, and I shared it with a lot of colleagues and with a lot of friends. And I didn't get a response from anyone except one gentleman called Noam Chomsky. And he said, don't expect to publish this anywhere this side of the Atlantic. Go back home and you might have a better, possibility there. Anyway, I sort of came back to India and meandering through various jobs and so on, I ended up ultimately deciding to teach philosophy. I quit economics, and for 5 years I taught philosophy. I went back abroad, I went to Europe for 4 years, and I taught philosophy, not intending to do economics again. I come back to India in 2006, and I realized that the country which I had left behind me when I first went to America in 1987 was no longer there, basically. A whole different country I was living in. I decided to sort of travel. I spent a lot of time traveling around the country, especially rural India, and got a bit reacquainted with the landscape. And when you actually start encountering realities in rural India and you sort of set them against what you read about in the media, then you realize there are so many countries here, at least two different ones. To put the matter very simply, India and Bharat are two different nations, have always been that way. So, I wanted to write about it, and I started writing articles and so on, which very few people would publish. Ultimately, Ashish and I got together because Ashish was with me in college, in Hindu college back in the early 1980s. And he called me for a conference on globalization and deforestation to Bhubaneswar. And they say nowadays that a lot can happen over coffee. We sort of sat in Cafe Coffee Day, and I gently broached the idea of a possible book together. This was around January of 2008. And Ashish almost immediately said, yes, let's do it. So that's how the book was born, the idea of the book. And then we spent the next 3 years virtually, sometimes forgetting the difference between night and day, and sometimes becoming extremely cranky and angry and so on. Anyway, that's sort of the background for the book. The book is always more important than the authors, and I think this one is probably more so. So I don't look upon it as my book actually. I look upon it as, it's almost, laying out the conditions which make our lives possible. Not just mine, but I think everybody sitting in this hall. There's a whole set of conditions, a whole set of natural conditions and conditions in which working people, especially in the Indian countryside, who are expending their blood, sweat and tears to make so much possible for the rest. So I look upon the book as a sort of third parent almost, because there's a documentation of facts. Facts are facts because they ultimately prevail, and we tend to forget that. And today what you see happening in India, not just in India but in much of the world, is actually a denial, a systematic, organized, orchestrated denial of facts. And you're confronted with plentiful mythologies and mass deceptions which have to be challenged. And the best ways to challenge them are not just on ground of reason, which is often the case, but on ground of facts. So there's a whole documentation in the book, and as one reviewer said, it reads like a war diary. And that's, I think, accurate, because a lot of development that you actually observe in the Indian countryside seems like, collateral damage of a war. So there's a sort of sense of public madness, if you will, which I sort of came to recognize has to be depicted. This is the sort of madness that we have gotten ourselves into. And how are we going to diagnose it, and how are we going to get out of it? Why have we sort of done this now? I think 2008 was a sort of preview of the sort of crisis that lie in the future, crisis in the plural, and crisis ongoing and total, and so on. In 2008 you had a financial crisis, which I read as a sort of shadow crisis of the ecological crisis. We are all caught today in a sort of global war between capital and nature, basically between the abstractions that modern man has created and the natural world, which works according to a completely different set of logics, which are actually impenetrable sometimes. There's a lot of mystery about nature which we tend to forget, and we tend to imagine that science has answered those questions, and it hasn't, and so on. That was 2008 when we started, and now when you look at the newspapers today, nothing has changed. Today's article by Paul Krugman in the Hindu, the title of the article is "Apocalypse Fairly Soon." So that's the kind of anguish and despair in the Western world over the Eurozone crisis. There's no way of getting around it. And if you look at the Business Standard, it says the rupee falls to lifetime low for third straight day. The rupee is almost, the dollar is almost 55 rupees now, and every day there's a record being broken by. There's active speculation now against the rupee. There's all sorts of anxieties about the twin deficits, the fiscal deficits, and the deficit and the balance of payments. And something like a magnified version of 1991 is knocking on our doors. So there's actual panic among policymakers, and it's unacknowledged panic, obviously, but the public should know. The public has a right to know, and the public should know there is something very serious which is amiss in the way things have been done over the last 20 years, and that has to be addressed. So the book is a sort of small attempt to sort of build the means of intellectual self-defense in a time of war. And I don't make any mistake about the fact that we are all on a battleground. We don't have any choice about that. What positions we will take, what stances we will adopt, what we will say and do, especially or undo, I think those are the critical questions. Socialism failed because it appealed to human morality, which is always very fragile. Capitalism is so difficult to root out because it appeals to human vanity more and more. The book tries to argue that there are third, fourth, fifth, sixth ways of doing things which have to be explored. And there's no better place on earth to do that than the country in which we live. So the book sort of closes with the conviction that if India cannot get its act together, nor can the world. And if India wants to continue to misunderstand its role in the world, it has only itself to blame and will ultimately pay a very, very heavy price for it. You're playing with very serious fire. You're not talking about, making revolution and those kinds of things. We're well past those times. We're talking about something much more serious. So in some sense, the set of facts which the book has sort of documented, I feel very humble before it. And I confess to a million hypocrisies which I partake of every day. But I think it has to be said. What has to be said has to be said. And then it's for each individual and community to decide what they want to do. We'll talk more in the discussion, and there's a lot more to say, of course. But I'll let Ashish take it over from here. I just want to close by saying that at some point we will be asked to make very clear decisions whether we want to remain a civilization or whether we want to become a completely outsourced project of global finance and ruin and destroy everything forever. Sorry to sound such a cynical note, but those are the facts. I hope we can find the optimism and, the second part of the book, which is all about hope and the future, about which I think Ashish is better prepared than I am.